Thank you, Betty. Hopefully you all can hear me. Thank you so much, all the people who are joining live and for those that are watching later. So we're going to be talking about the developer portal for Istio. Like Betty said, we announced this about a week ago, and it's an important component to the way that we at Solo look at APIs and look at helping folks solve the challenges around building microservices and exposing those APIs in a world that has, from an infrastructure perspective, fundamentally changed. And there are now new and better, more improved ways of solving some of the problems that we may have seen in the past. So my name is Christian. My background is in building large-scale services-based architectures. And I've done this at large enterprises. I've done this with my work at some of the cloud, the vanguards of the cloud platforms and web scale companies. I've been involved in open source now for quite a long time, contributing to open source, especially around communication. So things like building resilient systems around service mesh is something that I've been interested in the last 3 years or so. I wrote the first book on Istio, for example. I'm currently writing with my co-author Istio in Action, and I've written books on microservices and so forth. And I generally like to blog and talk and share my experiences working with customers as an architect, as someone who can help influence these architectures and these implementations. And I like to blog about them and share them with folks, including through slides. So check out the SlideShare that I have there. I came to Solo about 1.5 years ago from Red Hat, where I was the chief architect of cloud application development. And we started to get into this service mesh stuff there at Red Hat. I was a very big advocate of it. And I saw it as much more strategic to the API evolution and the API management evolution than some other folks. So I came to Solo specifically to focus on this problem. Now I've been around for long enough to know that getting applications to talk with each other, sharing information about those applications and those endpoints isn't entirely a new problem. But in the past, we've seen vendors and solutions and processes and even the organization, as they adopt this new technology or then that new technology, they would form around things like enterprise application integration, enterprise service buses, later API management vendors. And the goals there were to try to solve and kind of catalog and make sense of the applications that were that made up the enterprise, and implement cross-cutting things like transformation, like authentication, authorization, and so forth. And those, had their varying levels of success. But what's changed in the last, I would say, 5 years or so, is with the container revolution and the ability to bring cloud-like infrastructure to the enterprise through things like Kubernetes, through ubiquitous access to public cloud. The foundational infrastructure and the assumptions about the infrastructure has changed. So in this talk, we're going to look at some of the backdrop there, because it's important. There's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of different, sometimes confusing parts to the story that you might see, like service mesh and Envoy, API gateways, and all this stuff. But the genesis of it and the reason why it provides value and how it's different from the previous generations of technologies is actually quite important. And so here at Solo, what we're doing is we're helping to build this communications backbone for applications, so application level networking, that solves some similar problems that we saw in the past, but does it in a much more elegant way for the underlying infrastructure that we're deploying to today, where things like containers, things like Kubernetes, things like public cloud, things like even VMs on OpenStack or something, you know, these pieces of infrastructure are ephemeral, they're scaling and auto-scaling. The applications in them are becoming unhealthy. The applications in them might just be revving very quickly, right? The whole point of adopting some of this infrastructure and the application architectures to enable, you know, so like microservices, is to be able to go faster and deliver things faster, right? So the assumptions of the applications and the infrastructure underlying have changed. Now at Solo, we've caught the attention of the industry. We're exploding now. We've made key contributions and collaborations with industry partners like Microsoft, where we are working on things like the service mesh interface with them, something that we developed early on in 2018. We're working with HashiCorp. We integrate very nicely with HashiCorp. In fact, we wrote the original Glue Connect, or the precursor to Console Connect. So our expertise is in Envoy proxy and service mesh. We're working closely with Google around WebAssembly and Istio and so forth. So the vision that we have and the way that we're going about implementing these is resonating with our customers and with the industry at a whole. So specifically, Solo, what we're solving is adopting some of this new technology to solve things like application connectivity and resilience. So things like timeouts, retries, circuit breaking, retry budgets, deadlines, these type of distributed systems capabilities that your applications need to be aware of. We're also solving things like the decentralization of how you implement some of the access controls, the observability controls, and the security and so forth that we need. And you might have done with previous generations of technology in a more centralized location. I meet with enterprises all the time that have implemented a legacy API management vendor, and they originally brought that in to expose APIs publicly. And what ended up happening is they looked at the capabilities like security and observability, and they said, well, let's just run all our traffic through that. And so they built all these processes. You know, if you wanted to expose an API, you had to go to this team, you had to open up tickets, and everything would flow through this centralized point. So at Solo, we're looking at how do we build processes and technology to solve those problems in a more elegant way, in a decentralized way. When we start going to cloud, public cloud, on premises or wherever, you need to, security is number one. You have to solve for things like authentication, authorization, keeping traffic communication encrypted, and building up more of a zero trust model versus our previous iterations of perimeter-based security and so forth. And lastly, how do we manage this whole thing? How do we observe and understand what's happening across things like service mesh, things that might be running on premises or in a public cloud? And so that's what we're focused on building here at Solo, and we're gonna see that and how things like Istio Developer Portal ties in. So we're building foundationally on Envoy proxy. We saw very early on the potential with Envoy, things like its dynamic configuration, things like its extensibility, to be able to plug in additional protocols, additional features, and so forth. And we noticed this pretty early on, as this could be and should be the foundational piece to building distributed systems in a cloud-like environment, like a Kubernetes, like a public cloud, and the assumptions that come along with it. You need something that's highly dynamic, something that can be updated without dropping connections, something that's highly performant, and can be extended to keep up with the fast pace of innovation that's happening in the cloud-native ecosystem. And so Envoy proxy, we picked Envoy as so at Solo, our foundational competency is in Envoy, which extends to these various parts of the architecture to be able to solve some of these problems. At Solo, we see the journey as sort of iterative and starting with solving some of the problems at the edge of your application architecture. We built Glue as an edge or API gateway built on top of Envoy that you can use with or without a service mesh, and gives a lower barrier to entry for adopting Envoy-based technology, and solves the problems of the edge in a nice cloud native way. And I can explain that in a second. Now, a big part of decentralizing your API infrastructure is adopting the capabilities that the service mesh brings. So resilience, traffic control in an east-west traffic manner, strict identity and encryption between the services, observability, and so forth. And at Solo, what we're seeing is that's a great Envoy-based service meshes are a great solution to that east-west problem. But as you start to build out more clusters, that east-west problem starts to get blurry. Where exactly is east-west? And managing multiple clusters of service mesh and getting them to interact and interoperate with each other is a realistic problem that we already see our customers have, and is a growing problem. Each public cloud vendor will have its own service mesh. And there's already a number of service meshes out there right now. So we built Service Mesh Hub as a management plane to be able to federate these different clusters of service mesh and solve things like service discovery between them, failover between them, load balancing, identity federation, traffic control and access control and so forth between different service mesh clusters. And lastly, we understand that Envoy is a very forward-looking project and is innovative, and we want to help and be part of that innovation, especially around customizing Envoy and making it more powerful for those last mile integration use cases that you have when you try to bring in an Envoy-based solution. So WebAssembly allows you to inject your own custom code into Envoy proxy in a secure and dynamic way, so you can change the behavior of your mesh or your gateways to be, for example, backwards compatible with some existing capabilities you have today. So again, we are looking at this through the lens of decentralization, through building up on zero trust principles and providing a holistic management for your API infrastructure based on Envoy, whether that's service mesh, whether that's edge gateways, whether that's a combination of both, and whether that's on premises or in a public cloud. So we're able to kind of unify all of these deployments into a single pane of glass that allows you to control and secure your traffic, as well as expose and share the capabilities of your APIs with other parts of the organization. So a big part of that, here, let me just get through some of these slides, is, so this is basically what I said, where we have this management plane and the various components across multiple types of architectures deployed, where Envoy provides the backbone of these communication channels. And then we need a way to expose these APIs. We need a way to discover them. We need a way to document them, and do that in such a way that, number one, provides boundaries where API boundaries are needed. Once you start deploying tons of microservices all over the place, your application architecture and the boundaries within that architecture start to dissolve away. But that's not necessarily a good thing. So you still want some structure, you still want those boundaries, and finding a mechanism to delineate them and expose them in a consistent way is where we start to see the developer portals start to take shape. So looking at developer portals, it starts with securing the edge. That's where traffic starts to come into your infrastructure. And there are some key capabilities at the edge when you look at this, the three principles that I mentioned: decentralization, zero trust, and manageability. So at the edge, what we need is to establish boundaries and enforce and identify trust levels for traffic coming in to these boundaries. We need to authenticate the user and potentially the system that is being used to call into our architecture. We need to be able to write fine-grained authorization rules of the capabilities that they're allowed to have access to as they start to make their first steps into your application architecture. And we want encryption from, likely coming in to the gateway, but especially once we start to make our calls into the application architecture. We want to be able to pass along additional metadata about the request, identity about the user, and these types of things, and we need that traffic to be encrypted. We also need a place to apply traffic policies and traffic routing rules. Like I said, part of the reason for going to a microservices and cloud infrastructure is to be able to make things, make changes to the system faster. So we know there's going to be iterations. We know there's going to be new versions. We need to be able to control the traffic routing so that we can limit the exposure to some of these changes to our production users in a controlled way. We need to be able to observe and understand what's happening at the edge as traffic is coming into our system. We need to transform it, limit the request based on quotas. And we don't want to force everything through one single centralized implementation of this gateway. The role in general of the API gateway is sort of to abstract away some of the details of the services behind it, so that each service doesn't have to solve for these types of capabilities. And the API that you end up exposing on the API gateway can be viewed in terms of what's best for the client, not in terms of how it was implemented. And so so the API gateway and the edge gateway provides not only these security parameters on behalf of services, but also a abstraction layer, so you can decouple these implementation and usage of the service. So at Solo, as I mentioned briefly earlier, that we built Glue specifically for this problem. Glue is an API gateway built on Envoy proxy that enables this more sophisticated zero trust networking at the edge type proxy. So since it's built on Envoy, we get all the Envoy things out of the box, like traffic routing, like the telemetry and observability, like circuit breaking and so forth. And at Solo, we've added things like edge filters that live inside of Envoy that can do things like web application firewalling, like data loss prevention, like integration with LDAP, integration with Open Policy Agent. Right? So you can use declarative policy-driven pipelines to enforce, trust levels and access at the edge. And Glue also integrates very nicely with Istio, which we'll talk about in a second, to provide that secure communication channel between the edge and the rest of the service mesh. So I talked a little bit about that. Glue's architecture, like I said, is built on Envoy. We have some filters that extend it. We have a very simple control plane that enables things like external auth, rate limiting, and declarative configuration. And Glue is very well suited for the edge. Glue also has a developer portal, and everything we do in Glue, and actually any of our products, is based on declarative configuration. So we can use CRDs in Kubernetes to configure Glue and to configure the developer portal. Let me give you a quick sneak peek at Glue. So here's the Glue dashboard. Glue, like I said, is an edge proxy. We can configure very sophisticated security mechanisms around it. It's built on Envoy. We can see the health of the Envoy proxy here. It has a dev portal, which I mentioned. We can define APIs based on, let's say, the Open API spec. We can expose them in portals that are controlled by user self-service mechanisms, so people can come and sign up for and get API keys to be able to call into these services. Glue also does things like discovery, automatic discovery of runtime services. So for example, we have, in this case, we're connected to AWS. We can see what AWS Lambdas might be running in our AWS account, or what services might be running on EC2. We can also see things like some of our services running in Kubernetes that were automatically discovered are gRPC services, and we can inspect those services using gRPC reflection and build up a runtime catalog of what is available in our system. We do the same thing with Open API spec services, in this case, the default pet store. And so we can get a deep introspection understanding of what's actually happening at runtime. And then from there, we can compare that with what's in the portal and what's documented and start to detect drift and those types of things. Now, the Glue API gateway is very complementary to Istio or to a service mesh, for example, and provides these sophisticated capabilities. Now, depending on your architecture and the way you set up your edge, and there's a lot of different permutations and ways for doing that. I definitely encourage you to reach out to us at Solo. We've seen quite a few successful and not so successful architectures that follow these, the various permutations. But depending on how you set things up, maybe you do want to keep a centralized API gateway, or maybe you want to distribute and federate out your API gateways across multiple clusters, or something in between. You might run into scenarios where when you are adopting a service mesh as well, the service mesh comes with a fairly simple ingress gateway. So Istio, for example, has the ingress gateway. Console has a mechanism that's in a beta form for console 1.8 called the ingress gateway. And what these gateways enable is allowing traffic into your cluster. So if you have your API gateway and edge capabilities handled somewhere else and not directly in that cluster, you might have clusters with just very simple ingress gateways. And the purpose of these gateways is really just to allow traffic into the cluster and to give it some more application and domain specific routing capabilities. All right, so the traffic's coming in, likely it's already trusted. Maybe it's doing some simple pass-through to, or maybe some more sophisticated routing to services that might run in the mesh. Now, those APIs, when they are deployed inside of a mesh, they might be exposed to maybe external users through an API developer portal, maybe using Glue or something else. Now, for the services running inside the mesh, where you, as I said, already have you're using Istio as a pass-through to get into the mesh, and the traffic's likely already trusted and so forth, then what you still need to be able to do is identify what are those APIs, catalog them in a way that you can share them with other parts of the organization, and still build things like policies about how frequently users can call them. You still want to track which users are calling your services, your APIs. You want to give access keys to be able to do that. And you don't want to use a separate API gateway to do that. You want to use Istio. And that's why at Solo, we built the developer portal for Istio, because we see this problem of managing and documenting APIs as a holistic problem. This is not just for external APIs. This stretches across the communication boundaries that you have and the APIs that you try to expose. So the API Developer Portal is specifically to solve those problems where your APIs are running in a service mesh like Istio, and you want to expose them to other users within your organization, applications that might already be deployed inside of the mesh, and you need a nice, consistent way to organize them. So the Developer Portal for Istio adds things like the ability to expose APIs that are already running in your mesh as is. And I specify as is because, like I said, Istio Ingress Gateway is fairly simple. It doesn't do things like request and response transformations like you might expect in an API gateway. So you end up with APIs running and you want to expose them as is. The developer portal here allows you to add documentation and be spec driven, things like OpenAPI spec and gRPC. You can add things like rate limiting and external auth capabilities to the Istio Ingress Gateway for checking API keys and tracking usage of APIs and so forth. And then expose these APIs that you define through a portal that has some customization capabilities, so you can customize them for exactly the API product that you're building or that you're sharing, or the branding that you may have in your organization, and so forth. So how it works. So the Istio Developer Portal has two main components. One is the portal component, where we're exposing these UIs and the APIs in the portal. And the other is a controller component that is watching for the configuration that you use to drive the developer portal, which I mentioned earlier is based on custom resources, and we're going to look at that. And then what the controller does then is taking that configuration, whether it's specified in the UI or specified in a custom resource directly, we use that to drive the behavior of the Istio Ingress Gateway. So we know the Istio Ingress Gateway is very powerful for routing. So the Istio Developer Portal is building things like virtual services and destination rules and so forth. We know that out of the box, Istio Ingress Gateway does not have plugins for external auth and rate limiting, that kind of stuff. So we also generate envoy filters for these mechanisms to be able to configure the XAuth and rate limiting services. So you can see the controller part. What we're doing is watching these custom resources, which again could be generated by hand, by templates, by Helm, or by a user interface that comes with the developer portal. And we're watching specs like API docs, which is where we specify our API documentation, things like API products, which is where we specify the amalgamation of different APIs that we want to expose as a single product. We watch portals, portal CRs, where we define which API products to expose in a particular portal, and then the binding resources like routes that bind the specific API specifications to services running in Istio. And what that ends up creating are the virtual services, gateways, envoy filters, destination rules that Istio knows about. And then everything running under the covers at runtime is all Istio, right? So let me see if I can give you a quick demo and overview of that. We saw Glue and how Glue is a bit more powerful in terms of what it can do. Glue has its developer portal, which is the same. It's very similar to the same developer portal that we see in the UI, at least with the Istio, the developer portal for Istio. So we can see here, if we click on APIs, we don't have any APIs defined. We don't have any portals defined. What we want to do is create some new APIs. So we're going to do that. We'll call this we will first start by creating an API specification. We do that by giving it a doc spec, like an Open API spec or gRPC schemas. So if we click create API doc, we can upload a new doc. Let's find a pre-canned one. That would be in the developer portal for Istio. And resources, spec, let's do in the classic pet store example, we're going to create this API doc. And if we click on it, we can come in and see that it is identified, you know, it's looked at the doc, it's identified the different operations. It gives us an API editor if we want to go in and make some customizations to it. And from here, we can also, you know, we're going to create another one as part of this demo because I want to show a use case where we aggregate or stitch together multiple different APIs to form an API that we expose. So let's create that. And we see the Pet Store Special and Pet Store Classic have been created. Now, if we go to API products, what we can do is specify the API product, the APIs, a set of APIs that we want to expose on Istio's Ingress gateway. So this is Pet Store, Pet Store. That's 1.0. The domains that we want to use here, let's do something like petstore. A domain DNS that we already have set up. We can upload an image just to give it a little bit of color. Let's give it this one. And from here, based on the docs, the API specs that we've created, we can pick the different operations that will be included in this API product. So maybe what we want to do is maybe we have a version 1 or the classic version of Pet Store, and we want to keep its search functionality by finding pets. But then when we add pets, we want to do that to the new upgraded V2 version of the Pet Store. So if I click create the API product, we should now see our API product here. If I click into it, we can see some of the details about the API itself. We can here, we'll edit this and give it a default route binding so that if we were to call this, that it, well, let's save this, and that we would be able to default a route. So you can see this is starting to map a little bit to the Istio capabilities. We can also specify routing actions for different components in the API product. So now we've created our API docs, we've created our API product, but we haven't exposed anything yet. We haven't given anybody the ability to call it, or we're not cataloging it in a portal or anything. Before we do that, let's go in and create a plan, a usage plan for this API. Let's call this a Pet Store plan, and just plan. And in this area, we'll give it a rate limiting of 5 requests per hour. So if you were to call this, it's 5 requests per hour. So now we see that plan. So before we go on, I want to come back and point out that all of these, everything that's happening in the developer portal is driven by CRDs or CRs, custom resources, right? So if I do get CRD on this Kubernetes cluster, that's solo, we should see things like the API docs. So if I do get the API docs and all the namespaces, we should see we have the API doc for Pet Store Classic and Pet Store Special. If we actually look at one of them, we can see that it has linked it to where the doc exists. In this case, it's a config map. And this backend is pluggable. It doesn't have to be a config map. It could be A Git repo could be anywhere. And then we've processed that API. And in the status here, you can see we've identified the different operations that exist on that API, which can then be used in other parts of our configuration. So for example, we created an API product. So we should see that also. And if we take a look at the API product, we see the API product. And in the resource, in the custom resource, we specify the different APIs which come from the classic API doc and these operations, as well as the special API doc and only this operation. You can see the default routing that we've specified, some image details, and the usage plans that we've attached to this. And in the status, what we end up seeing is the actual open API spec that we will expose externally. So as a user of the developer portal for Istio, this is the API that we'll see, this amalgamated API. So that all looks good. Let's expose this API in a portal. So if I click create portal, this name of this pet store portal, this will be host 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm running this locally. If I click on upload an image, let's upload this one. Let's say we can actually upload, let me make sure I have that image. Should just be in the same location, right? Yep, pet store logo. Next. The APIs that we want to expose on this portal, we'll expose the API or the API product that we want to expose. Here's the pet store. I have a user pre-created here, and we will, there's no group access. So if we click create the portal, what we should see is our portal get created here. If I click on it, we can see we do have access to customizing some of the branding components. So let's say we want to change some of the colors. Maybe it'll match a little bit better with the images that we picked. So let's just change these a little bit. Okay, publish changes. Now, if we come over here to our APIs, we can see, actually, refresh, did it publish? It did not publish. We can see that the API is unpublished at the moment. Why is that? We see our, oh, all right, well, looks like the demo guys are not on my side today. Which is maybe an opportunity here to show a little debugging, and as well the the fact that things are written in CRDs should give us, we can try to do a little debugging here. So let's start by looking at the portal here, and we see the pet store portal. Get the portal. And dev portal. All right, so let's take a look at some stuff here. Well, we did change some of that. We see that's all good. That's all right. Primary logo, published API products. So this is a maybe a good example to point out here. At Solo, we believe in being able to delegate APIs and delegate responsibility for different components in the API. And so in Glue, for example, we have the ability to delegate out the routing rules to actual developer teams. So your operations team can own the security components, your developer teams can own the routing and transformation components. And we do that using delegation and matching. So especially in Kubernetes, this is a powerful approach, is to use labels to then go at runtime dynamically find the components that should be part of that group. And in this case, for portals, we're expecting a match label that, that looks like this to appear on the API product, which means your portal and the branding and all that stuff can be owned by one part of the organization, and specifying the APIs and the routing rules and all that stuff can be owned by a different one. So that's the match label that we are expecting to find on our API product. Let's do a get API product, pet store. Let's make sure this label is on there. Let's come back up. It's kind of on status there. I look for the spec. I see the metadata and I don't see the labels. So for some reason, somehow the label did not get added there. Let's see if we can go off the cuff here. Might not work, but let's give it a try. Now if we switch back to the API, the UI, come back to our APIs, refresh. No, still not published. So the demo seems to have gotten a little bit sideways on me right here. But what I was planning to show, and maybe I can show it to the Glue dev portal, is that once you've published your portals, and it would work exactly the same way for the Istio portal, is click on that. You know, that's probably, oh, actually, because of the port forwarding and the local host here, the portal does come up, but I don't think the APIs are correctly associated. Oh, it is. All right, well, something's a bit strange. Maybe running Glue and Istio side by side here for the developer portal stuff, it might be stomping on each other, I'm not sure. But demo gods were not my side, but this is effectively what it would look like. You would have the portal with the pet store APIs exposed, and you know, you can call them, you can ask for API keys. In this case, we do see API keys. You can take that API key, and let's give it a try over here. Take that API key and call petstore.myddns. I think it's API/pets. And we do see that it works. If I were to not use that key, I would be denied. If I do use that key and do it too many times, so that's 3, 4, 5, the next time here, we should see that our quota and policy about usage kicks in. We see that that's been enforced there. And all of this is being driven by Istio. And so here's the Istio virtual services that were generated automatically by the developer portal. So we can see that. We can see the Envoy filters that were added to support the virtual the rate limiting and the external auth. So we can see in here, depending on which one we're looking at. Wow, it's not viewed as YAML. Let's look at each one. We can see that the developer portal for pet store, the Envoy filter, we can see the configuration for rate limiting and external auth and so forth. So it's configured that way. So wrapping up here and kind of reiterating what we saw, the developer portal gives you a way of specifying your APIs that run in your Istio service to automatically generate the configuration that you'll need to be able to call those services. You can put things like API key security, rate limiting, policy around that, and allow developers to access these APIs, and you can customize the look and feel of the portal and so forth. So I encourage you to come stop by our Slack and get your hands on the Istio Developer Portal or the Glue Developer Portal, and give us feedback. We think that the vision that we're driving to here resonates with a lot of our customers and prospects. And if you'd like to get involved both on the open source side and the help as a customer to help drive the implementation of this, we would love that. So definitely reach out to us. So with that, I can open it up to questions.
Yeah. There's a question here on the the Istio developer portal for Istio as well as Glue. Like, do you use one over the other? Because they are different. And if you could kind of explain when to use one over the other and how they would potentially interact.
Yeah. So the question is when to use the Istio Developer Portal over the Glue Developer Portal. And the answer is fairly straightforward in that you use the Glue Developer Portal when you're using Glue to manage access to your APIs. Glue can do that for both your APIs running in a service mesh as well as those running outside of the service mesh. And Glue can be deployed on Kubernetes and outside of Kubernetes. So you can see Glue is a little bit more broad in its implement and how you actually implement it and use it to secure the edge of your application architecture. So the next part of that that architecture would be if you're using Istio and you have Glue in front of Istio as well, then just use the Glue Developer Portal, because we can still control all of the configurations for Glue through the Glue Developer Portal. Now, like I said, if you end up with an architecture, and a common one that we see kind of springing up is for right and wrong, right? There's pros and cons about this. For what we see springing up is deploying Glue in its own Kubernetes cluster, and maybe you have a bunch of different glue proxies there, right? Maybe different applications, but you need an edge, and you want that edge to be kind of located in its own Kubernetes cluster. Now, from there, we can apply, zero trust security policies. We can apply things like decentralized configuration and allowing the teams to manage their own configurations and so forth, and still have from an operational standpoint, the proxies deployed in a single Kubernetes cluster. Now, when those proxies try to route, they won't route to any services living in that cluster. They'll route to other clusters where the services will actually live, sort of leaf clusters. And this can be connected up with Istio for that hop to the other cluster. But then once the traffic gets into that leaf cluster, you might not have or need a full-blown API gateway in that cluster. Maybe you're just using the Istio ingress gateway there. And so that's where, as part of the slides, that ingress gateway is going to provide simple pass-through, application-specific routing, and so forth. But you will still have those APIs running in there. And the APIs that you expose on the gateway might be for internal or external use, but you might have some other APIs running in the leaf clusters that aren't part of what you expose on the API gateway. And you might use then the Istio Developer Portal to kind of catalog and provide access to internal teams for those services running there. So you have a few different options depending on your architecture. And that's why I'm saying reach out to us, because we've seen the myriad of different architectures. We can give you the pros and cons of each. And more importantly, give guidance for what's best for your specific use case.
Great. Another question here is, can you test an API via MTLS from the portal?
That is a good question. From a technology standpoint, we should be able to. I haven't tried it, but that is an important consideration when testing the API. So the developer portal for Istio that we have right now is the initial release, right? We know that there's going to be a lot of questions or requests for enhancement, questions, and so forth. On the MTLS from the test portal, I'm not 100% sure. We can follow up afterward and blog about that or something.
Yeah, looks like
but we should be able to do it. It's
just
something that we
something
can put
we
on the
haven't
roadmap
just
and
tried
do.
ourselves yet, right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. There's a question here on you actually touched on this briefly, but you've shown that the developer portal can expose API products on the Ingress gateway. What if the user doesn't want to expose them publicly, but use that to enforce concepts inside the service mesh, like rate limits and security? Is that a feasible use case?
So expose publicly is definitely one of the use cases that we have in mind, where traffic. But so right now,
but to not expose publicly, but using the portal to do things like enforce things like rate limits and security instead, without exposing them publicly.
So it's the part about public that is kind of the sticking point, right? And also, but I'll be more specific in the answer. The Istio Developer Portal today drives the configuration of the Istio Ingress gateway or of an Istio Ingress gateway. Now, whether that gateway is exposed publicly, that's a different consideration. Now, if they're asking specifically, can you use a developer portal to enforce policy between the services running in the mesh, not necessarily the traffic coming into through the Ingress gateway? The answer is that is not something that we can do right now. But obviously that is the logical next step, but I don't want to give away too much of the roadmap.
Another question on is the user able to see any tracing or stats for these APIs from the portal?
Yes, so everything running through the gateway here, just like in Istio, is tracked by Envoy. And we can get all of the telemetry, everything that you can get out of Envoy. Now, for a higher level, like per user, per customer, per application type statistics, that is something that we are able to capture as well. And we do that for example, for Glue. So we should be able to do the same thing for Istio as well.
And then a question here around the tech stack for building the behind the developer portal for Istio, and will it ever, is it possible to be pluggable to like other UI frameworks? Well, I guess this might be a future. And Joseph, you got a lot of great questions here. We might want to follow up directly to better understand some of your use case. But wondering if the dev portal itself is like pluggable.
Yeah, that is. So right now, its customization is limited to being able to specify colors and images and pages and that kind of stuff. We have had a lot of requests to be able to customize the developer portal with a lot more fidelity, and that is coming. That is coming.
Great. And then let's see. And then last question here is, can you give an example of what can be restricted with using kind of like the OPA integration for auth?
Yeah, I definitely can. And actually, a better way would just be to show you. If we come here and let's just do a search for OPA. So in Glue, what we can do is as requests. I think there's some examples here of the OPA rego. Yep. So this is a fairly simplistic one. Well, we can start with the attributes of the HTTP request. We can do things like check the JOTs, check the headers, check the various attributes, and evaluate that against well-known predicates and expressions and so forth. We can also, following OPA, the OPA plugins that we have, or we did this specifically for this type of integration. The OPA, the API keys, the LDAP, the OIDC, all the stuff that we've implemented in Glue at the edge, web application firewalling, all this stuff, it's actually implemented as a set of external auth plugins. And these plugins, obviously, you can write your own. And we do have users who are writing their own plugins to be able to plug into a more centralized policy engine that does way more sophisticated things. So we can use Glue, or we can use that extension point to build a more customized policy enforcement. But otherwise, with OPA directly, you have access to Rego, and you can write the policies there.
Great. And so we're just at time. Christian, thanks again for presenting today and the demos and answering so many questions. We've got more questions that have come up. So what we can do is follow up with some of you all directly after, or you're also welcome to join our Slack channel, slack.solo.io. And we actually have a specific channel just dedicated to the Dev Portal where you can ask questions related to both the Glue and the Istio Developer Portal. So looking forward to furthering the discussion there. And, if there's any, and based on the questions, if there's more detailed demos that we can do in the future, we're happy to put those together for you. So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.